bringing complex ideas down to earth, based on their value, not group identity. This is the Daily Archetype.
If man's striving for a spiritual goal is not a genuine instinct, but merely the result of a particular social development, then an explanation according to sexual principles is the most appropriate and the most acceptable to reason. But even if we grant the striving for wholeness and unity the character of a genuine instinct, and base our explanation mainly on this principle, the fact still remains that there is a close association between sexual instinct and the striving for wholeness. With the exception of religious longings, nothing challenges modern man more consciously and personally than sex. One can also say in good faith that he is possessed even more by the power instinct. This question will be decided according to temperament and one's own subjective bias. The only thing we cannot doubt is that the most important of the fundamental instincts, the religious instinct for wholeness, plays the least conspicuous part in temporary consciousness because, as history shows, it can free itself only with the greatest effort and with continual backslidings from contamination with the other two instincts. These can constantly appeal to common, everyday facts known to everyone. But the instinct for wholeness requires for its evidence a more highly differentiated consciousness, thoughtfulness, reflection, responsibility, and sundry other virtues. Therefore, it does not commend itself to the relatively unconscious man driven by his natural impulses, because, imprisoned in his familiar world, he clings to the commonplace, the obvious, the probable, the collectively valid, using for his motto, "Thinking is difficult, therefore let the herd pronounce judgment." Carl Jung, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky, paragraph 653. Physical life, then power instincts, then the herd must be overcome to adhere to the highest instinct of wholeness. The crowd loves the criminal much more than the philosopher, insomuch as the criminal raises up the crowd, but true philosophers lower the crowd to its proper position below the honest, thinking individual. If you put faith in your truth, or the group's half-truths, it's still faith. The difference is, your truth leads to adventure and strength by short-term sacrifice for long-term rewards. Meanwhile, the group's half-truths lead to aimless pacifism and cyclical dishonest justification, until individuals are so weak they hear again their soul that desires purposeful adventure and true wisdom.
If you want someone to remain ignorant, just make sure they think in groups of identity rather than groups of values. Let's promote understanding, not ignorance.
Welcome to the Daily Archetype, a value-sharing community.
Dialectics is the teaching which shows how opposites can be, and how they happen to be, how they become identical, under what conditions they are identical, transforming themselves into one another, while the human mind should take these opposites not as dead, rigid, but as living, conditional, mobile, transforming themselves into one another. Vladimir Lenin.
What does this passage mean? The contradictory aspects in every process exclude each other, struggle with each other, and are in opposition to each other. Without exception, they are contained in the process of development of all things and in all human thought. A simple process contains only a single pair of opposites, while a complex process contains more. And in turn, the pairs of opposites are in contradiction to one another. That is how all things in the objective world and all human thought are constituted, and how they are set in motion. This being so, there is an utter lack of identity or unity. How then can one speak of identity or unity? The fact is that no contradictory aspect can exist in isolation. Without its opposite aspect, each loses the condition for its existence. Just think. Can any one contradictory aspect of a thing or of a concept in the human mind exist independently? Without life, there would be no death. Without death, there would be no life. Without above, there would be no below. Without below, there would be no above. Without misfortune, there would be no good fortune. Without good fortune, there would be no misfortune. Without facility, there would be no difficulty. Without difficulty, there'd be no facility. Without landlords, there would be no tenant peasants. Without tenant peasants, there would be no landlords. Without the bourgeoisie, there would be no proletariat. Without the proletariat, there would be no bourgeoisie. Without imperialist oppression of nations, there would be no colonies or semi-colonies. Without colonies or semi-colonies, there would be no imperialist oppression of nations. It is so with all opposites. Under given conditions, on the one hand, they are opposite to each other. On the other, they are interconnected, interpenetrating, interpermeating, and interdependent. And this character is described as identity. Under given conditions, all contradictory aspects possess the character of non-identity and hence are described as being in contradiction. But they also possess the character of identity and hence are interconnected. This is what Lenin means when he says that dialectics studies how opposites can be identical. How then can they be identical? Because each is the condition for the other's existence. This is the first meaning of identity. But is it enough to say merely that each of the contradictory aspects is the condition for the other's existence? That there is identity between them and that consequently they can coexist in a single entity? No, it is not. The matter does not end with their dependence on each other for their existence. What is more important is their transformation into each other. That is to say, in given conditions, each of the contradictory aspects within a thing transforms itself into its opposite, changes its position to that of its opposite. This is the second meaning of the identity of contradiction. Why is there identity here too? You see, by means of revolution, the proletariat, at one time the ruled, is transformed into the ruler, while the bourgeoisie, the erstwhile ruler, is transformed into the ruled and changed its position to that originally occupied by its opposite. This has already taken place in the Soviet Union, as it will take place throughout the world. If there were no interconnection and identity of opposites in given conditions, how could such a change take place? The Kuomintang, which played a certain positive role at a certain stage in modern Chinese history, became a counter-revolution party after 1927 because of its inherent class nature and because of imperialist blandishments, these being the conditions, but it has been compelled to agree to resist Japan because of the sharpening of the contradiction between China and Japan and because of the Communist Party's policy of the United Front, these being the conditions. Things in contradiction change into one another, and herein lies a definite identity. Our agrarian revolution has been a process in which the landlord class owning the land is transformed into a class that has lost its land, while the peasants who once lost their land are transformed into smallholders who have acquired land, and such a process will occur yet again. Under given conditions, having and not having, acquiring and losing, are interconnected. The two sides have a single identity. Under socialism, private peasant ownership is transformed into the public ownership of socialist agriculture. This has already taken place in the Soviet Union, as it will take place everywhere else. There is a bridge leading from private property to public property, which in philosophy is called identity or transformation into each other, or interpenetration. Excerpt from On Practice and Contradiction, Mao Zedong.
Narrated by Eli Harris.
Gary Middleton.
The daily archetype, a value-sharing economy.
You've also called trans campaigners authoritarian, haven't you? I mean, isn't that
well, only in the broader context of my claims that radical leftist ideologues are authoritarian,
yes,
which they are.
You're saying someone who's trying to work out their gender identity, who may well have struggled with that, had quite a tough time over the years.
With it, yeah.
You're comparing them with, you know, Chairman Mao, who saw the deaths of millions of people. Well, even if the activists, you know, they're trans people too. They have a right to say these things.
Yeah, but they don't have a right to speak for their whole community.
To compare them to Chairman Mao or, you know, Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet. I mean, you know, this is grossly insensitive.
I didn't compare them to Pinochet.
Well,
I did compare them to
He was an authoritarian.
He's a right-winger, though. I was comparing them to the left-wing totalitarians. Okay. And I do believe they are left-wing totalitarians.
Under Mao, millions of people died.
Right.
I mean, there's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
No, I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. It matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
You're just saying these things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean, you are a provocateur.
I never say
You're like
anything.
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to. You want to stir things up.
I'm only a provocateur insofar as when I say what I believe to be true, it's provocative. I don't provoke. Maybe for humor,
you don't set out
now and then. I'm not.
Bringing complex ideas down to earth, based on their value, not group identity. This is the Daily Archetype.